If you went to a national popular vote system, right, where it's everybody votes, you would need 0 minorities to win the presidency.
There are growing calls to eliminate the Electoral College and criticisms that it's racist. But what many do not realize is the Electoral College actually amplifies the voices of ethnic minorities in America. So argues Matt Taylor, the director of the film Safeguard, an Electoral College story. In this episode, Taylor explains what the Electoral College actually does, common misconceptions around it, and what would happen if it no longer existed. This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jan Jekielek. Matt Taylor, such a pleasure to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here today.
So Matt, we're just a few weeks away from the election, November 3rd. A lot of people are talking about something they don't often talk about, the Electoral College.
Yes.
I believe in the film it's described as a strange beast.
Yes.
By Professor Spalding.
Yes.
I never imagined someone would actually make a film about the Electoral College. But before we go into that, why don't you just tell me what exactly is the Electoral College and how does it work?
Well, that is a topic which has a PhD attached to it. It's a very complicated kind of answer, but on the other hand, it's also quite simple. The Electoral College is a method in the Constitution for selecting the President of the United States, which is the executive of the United States. And the way it essentially works is that every state has an election, and that state gets to determine how that election awards a certain number of electors to who will be the president. And so to simplify it, if you take a state like, let's say, California, which has 55 electoral votes, what is an electoral vote? What an electoral vote is actually a person. It's a person named an elector that the state chooses, and whichever democratic way that state goes, all of those electors will be awarded to the president, and the president has to get 270 electoral votes by accumulating all of these elections all over the country to become the president. And that's how the system works. It's a system that has largely been intact since its conception, with some minor changes in the early days with the 12th Amendment and other things. But for the most part, that's how we elect our president, by this 51 different elections that happen throughout the United States, and then it's all accumulated and you become the president on January 20th.
Well, one of the things I didn't know, which I learned in the film, there are many things, frankly, but was just how you decide how many electors or electoral votes there are, and it's just the number of congressional members. I thought that was, so you kind of go quite deep, but in a kind of unexpectedly, frankly, engaging way in this film. So what is the genesis of this?
Well, you know, the thing is, again, the Electoral College is one of those things that people don't think about. And I don't blame them for not thinking about it. It comes up once every 4 years for a couple months. It is kind of an abstracted system. It's just been around. But in the 21st century, we've had a couple incidents where the popular vote has not lined up with the Electoral College vote, right? And that's 2 in the 21st century. There's been 5 total in the entire history of the United States. So it has become more of a topic in the last 20 years or so. And so what's really important is to understand why we have it, where it came from, and what are some of the consequences if you tinker with the system.
Well, it is also really interesting because for a lot of people around the world in democratic societies, for example, parliamentary democracy is a typical model, right? And that's actually quite different from the U.S. The U.S. has, the executive is chosen independently of Parliament, which is, anyway, again, quite interesting. And of course, the Electoral College figures in here. So one of the big charges, I guess, against the Electoral College, which I've seen leveled, is just simply that it's actually undemocratic. Right? That is actually, well, if most people want things to be a particular way, or most people want to choose a particular person to be the president, seems obvious, right? That it should be that way. So the film obviously speaks to this. Tell me about this.
Well, we speak to democracy in the film in a very interesting way because we are not a democracy, right? And people go, "Oh my goodness, no, we're not. We're basically a constitutional republic." And so the country has never been a democracy, but there are democratic systems all throughout the Constitution. So, essentially, we vote elected representatives to then represent us like a republic in the government body. And so the idea that it's 51 to 49 was never really part of the system. Now, it does play into the individual states because as a country that is under a federalist system, the states have a lot of rights in how they elect their electors and how they conduct their business, and that is separate from the federal government. And so the idea is that what the founders did not want was mob rule. They didn't want 51% of people just saying, you know what, we don't like this and it's gone. We have fundamental rights. The Bill of Rights is the most undemocratic part of the Constitution because it says no matter how much you want a national church, you can't have one. No matter how much you want to ban free speech, these are rights that are fundamentally yours that are not up to a democratic vote. So democracy is respected. It is important as parts of the system, but we are just technically not really a democracy. We are a republic and a constitutional republic because the Constitution, again, stops the democratic mob from voting, against a minority or suppressing a minority.
So Matt, what would you say is one of the biggest misconceptions around the Electoral College that you came across?
So a really important aspect that the Electoral College protects, one of the criticisms is that it's racist, right? And the thing is that if you take the last major presidential election we had, which is the 2016 presidential election, and you take all the people who voted in the presidential election, roughly 135 to 38 million people, and you were to just isolate the individual demographics, and you would have roughly 35 million minorities. That's roughly 16.5 million African Americans and 12.2 million Hispanics, and then everybody else, Asian, and so on. And so if you went to a national popular vote system, right, where it's everybody votes, you would need 0 minorities to win the presidency. That is why the Electoral College matters. You could win the presidency with only white people. Because 16.5 million African Americans is not enough to win anything. But the way the Electoral College works is if you take a state like Virginia, Virginia is 20% African American. So if your state is splitting out to 47-47, suddenly your minority voice becomes a tipping point of that state, which means you have amplified your voice from a tiny minority to actually mattering more than everybody else, because you are the tipping point in those states. You're the tipping point in Michigan. You're the tipping point in New York. You're the tipping point in Georgia, right? If you had a national popular vote and you're a minority, you don't matter. I don't need you to win the election. But with the Electoral College, because it's broken down state to state, and because the demographics are all broken up in these different ways, I do need your voice, and your voice does matter. So that is why the Electoral College matters to people on the ground, because it gives you a voice. Otherwise, national popular vote, why would you talk to anybody in rural areas? Why would you talk to anybody who is a racial minority or an economic minority or a sexual minority? These are all tiny numbers when you just talk about just numbers. I will just pick the numbers where I can get the most numbers, the least diverse, and I can win an election. The Electoral College stops that dead in its tracks. And it makes it so that anyone in this room right now could be the tipping point. So the candidate doesn't know who the tipping point will be. So the candidate needs to, A, talk to all of us and try to appeal to all of us, hence moderating and becoming a unifier and not a divider. That is perhaps one of the most important points of why the Electoral College protects people on the ground, personally and individually.
Well, and in fact, I mean, I think you actually argue this in the film. That was actually part of the purpose of it in the first place, is to make sure that the minority voices had a voice.
Absolutely. I mean, because look, at the time, everything, it took a horse to get everywhere. It was and look, it's not a perfect system. I mean, there are problems, and sometimes, guys get elected. Again, the popular vote and the electoral vote don't always match. But there have been scenarios in history where the electoral vote has mattered so much. For example, in the election of Abraham Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln is the lowest voted president in. He's I think 38%, but he wasn't on the ballot in a bunch of the states in the South. But his electoral win was huge. He won all the states in the Northeast. He won the Mid-Atlantic states. He won the Midwestern states. He won the new states in the West. That electoral vote is what caused him to be the president. So without the Electoral College, there is no Emancipation Proclamation. He would not be president if it was just popular vote. Also, John F. Kennedy, he barely wins in 1960, barely. It's such a tiny, tiny sliver, but his electoral college win is massive. And so again, these are two presidents who won because of the electoral college, who ushered in massive, massive civil rights and abolition policies that changed the course of the country. And we do owe it greatly to the electoral college, And so it's one of those systems where, if you rip it out of the clockwork of the government, it will take many other things with it and cause irreparable damage, and people will lose rights, and that's what we don't want. We want to protect your individual rights as a country. It's not always perfect, but ultimately, generally speaking, it works, and we should probably just leave it alone.
What was just striking me, something that comes through in the film, which I frankly hadn't thought of in this way before, but that the system, as it's structured in the U.S., the goal is to facilitate democracy. This is how I interpreted it. But at the same time, safeguarding individual rights or liberty, I think, as it's described. Now that's very interesting. And from your experience, how is that different from other democratic systems that you're aware of?
Well, the irony is that, every American is an individual, right? But individual rights are actually at odds with democracy. Because what is democracy? Well, it's a whole group of people. So you have to choose one or the other, right? And of course, this is always an issue. Do you want individual rights, or do you want, this kind of democracy where everybody kind of gets one pizza? You don't get individual pizzas, you get one pizza. And so other countries, I mean, France is a direct democracy. I think they're one of the most direct democracies in the world. And what happens is you end up just having these shifts, or what you'll have many parties that actually you win by plurality. So you actually end up getting the most votes out of 17 different people, which will end up being 20%, which then it's completely undemocratic, even though you got the most votes technically. And so I think that our system has, while not perfect, has found the way to satisfy the most amount of people without, completely trampling minority rights. And in a lot of ways, minorities become, and when I say minorities, it's across a whole different spectrum of minorities, become a pivot point on which, the election can hinge, or which rights can be established. So it does actually, the Electoral College is fundamentally about minority rights. By not allowing a democratic mob or majority or 50+1 to rule over any given minority in a system. So essentially, if you have basically just flat out democracy, it means whoever has the most votes, 50+1, always wins. What that means is I don't want to have any kind of ideological or philosophical wavering. I want to have the least diverse group, but just +1, right? Because what happens if you have a very diverse group, you can't pull the coalitions together to get 50+1. So you want to eliminate as much diversity as possible. And so, for example,
so you're saying this in terms of political strategy, basically.
Sure,
if
absolutely.
If I'm running to be wanting to be elected, now I'm going to try to eliminate diversity. Okay.
Yeah, you want as little diversity.
Counterintuitive.
Well, think about it, right? If you have a whole series of minority groups and they can't get 51%, let's say they're 20% and 15% and 12%, but I can find just one more vote than you, then I win. And then I get to determine the rules and so on and so forth. The way the Founding Fathers saw it was, well, that's dangerous. So what you do is you actually break it up into tons of tiny little groups that are always warring with each other, who have to form coalitions, and you have to reach across the aisle to get a majority. And what does that do? It moderates your view. So if you have 20 different tiny groups and they all have different interests because we're all individuals, then it means that I have to reach across the aisle and say, hey, look, we differ in these ways, we have different opinions, but let's figure out a way to band together, and then we can vote together and we can win the election. And what that does is it ultimately creates more diversity, more coalitions, because just because you get into Congress, just because you're a Democrat or Republican, there's 435 congressmen and 100 senators, they all have to answer to individual constituencies across the entire country. And this is a big country. So you may have a congressman in Alabama and you may have a congressman in Wyoming. Those are very different constituencies, and they may both be Democrats, but they still have to figure out a way to work together with different geographies, different industries. These are different places. And so it is still a coalition. Just because a party wins a branch or a party wins multiple branches of the government doesn't mean that everything just flows in one direction. It's constantly coalition building. You're constantly trying to work together, and you're constantly diversifying. And that is a brilliant, beautiful system that unifies the entire country, as opposed to one geographical region or one ideology banding together to knock out everybody else. And that is the beauty of the system, and that is how the Electoral College is the underpinning that brings it all together.
Okay, so that's a super positive vision, I suppose, right? But it seems to stand in the face of, when we look at politics today, where it seems to be this, very strong polarization. And you don't, at least, what we hear is we don't have a lot of people reaching across the aisle. It just seems to be absent, at least. So how do you square this vision of how our politics seem to be working right now with the vision of the Founding Fathers, which presumably is still in effect?
I mean, look, I would argue that what is reported and what is actually happening is very different, right? A Democrat in Iowa and a Democrat in Connecticut are very, very different. A Democrat in a Republican in Connecticut would be a Democrat in Iowa, right? You have these different political spectrums. You have different geographies and things like that. The average person, Democrat or Republican or independent, they only differ on minor issues, right? There's only so many issues, whether it's, social issues or economic issues. But for the most part, people are just people. And so once the election year comes around, there's a lot of reporting about this, the polar aspect of politics. But it's not as polar on the ground as it is, say, maybe in Washington or in some of these more kind of one-party areas. And that's another thing, is that the Electoral College prevents one-party, highly populated areas from dominating over, guess what, the minority of the country. Because if you had basically just majority rules, then a candidate would only have to go to New York City, Chicago, Los Angeles. That's one kind of vote. Remember, I said you just get as small and least diverse as possible, but +1. So essentially, the Electoral College, again, makes it so that people have to diversify. And I don't think the electorate is as polarized as is reported. I think again, if you take a person from Iowa and you take a person from Alabama and you take a person from Florida and a person from California, let's say they're all business owners in their different parties, they'll find many things to agree upon because again, in the country, in the United States, we're a diverse country with commerce and all sorts of things going on. You'll find that they'll differ on certain issues, but they won't differ on every issue. But you'll find the same thing within the Democratic and within the Republican Party. You'll find Republicans in New York are different than Republicans in Alabama. They won't agree on many things, but they'll agree on some things. And the Electoral College is one of those things that connects those people around the country together to vote for a single executive.
That's, again, super, super fascinating. One of the things that's, I guess, the obvious thing about the elimination, let's say, of the Electoral College, which is something that seems to be being discussed right now, is that these super high, I guess, density areas on the coast, some of these cities would get to kind of decide the election in a sense, right? So that's the obvious thing. But there's also a number of things which you bring up in the film which are not nearly as obvious. I wonder if you could speak to that a bit.
Well, it's interesting. Again, if the Electoral College is just, first of all, it's just a system, right? This is what's interesting. Everyone talks about the Electoral College as the boogeyman. It's just a system. People vote, and then they select their electors, and the electors go to the candidate who got the most states. And here's the thing, a state can choose how to allocate its electors. So not all states are winner take all. In fact, Nebraska and Maine are proportional delegates. So people get delegates proportionately. So it is a states thing. It keeps an election in the states. And this is a kind of a very important point. If you eliminated the Electoral College, the federal government would have to take over how the presidential election works, right? Because right now, we're in the state of New York. New York has 29 electors. And so in New York State, everybody will vote, and whoever, whether it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden, will get those electors, whoever gets the majority. And New York State can determine that. And New York State doesn't have to come under the rules of Virginia or Iowa or Texas. They all get to determine how the election works, how they set their rules, what the hours are, how they do balloting. I mean, this is the big discussion right now about mail-in ballots. But it is a state issue. These are states' rights, and the state can set all those things. If you got rid of the Electoral College, you would essentially get rid of the state lines that separate all those states and give them autonomy, right? Which means the federal government would then have to control the election. Now imagine this. If you have corruption in one of these states, because the state is self-contained, the corruption is self-contained. But if you eliminated those states and put it in one place and you corrupted at the federal level, well, then you would corrupt the entire election. And there's no way to contain the corruption. We see, say, in Florida in 2000, there was a recount. And this is very important because we're about to head into potentially a very contentious election in the next 22 days. And so you have Florida, and Florida had the recount in 2000. Imagine if you did not have the Electoral College, it would not contain it to that state. It would happen. You would have recounts in every precinct in the country, and that means you would be counting ballots for weeks, months, or maybe even years, because every precinct. Because guess what? There's no states. There's no rules. It's one set of rules, and everybody needs one more vote. So you would potentially never stop counting. Because, we found some more ballots here and we found some more ballots there. That's how critical it would be. It would almost be like an Argentine election. So these are some of the issues that that the Electoral College eliminates. Is it makes it so that fraud is contained in one place. Because imagine if we could not name a president for months or even years, the ramifications worldwide for foreign policy and everything else would be catastrophic. So that's one of the issues. The other great thing about the Electoral College is it eliminates candidates who are extreme. And the reason it does that is that if you have to travel around the country, you have to have a diverse, a number of views. You have to, again, I bring up Iowa, I bring up Florida, Texas. You have to have views that are more moderate because all of these people are different. If you just had to go to one place and find that 51%, right in that one area, you could have extreme views because you wouldn't have to worry about the other 50 states. If you look at 2016, it said that Hillary Clinton took the Rust Belt for granted. She didn't go to the states, and they said, well, if you're not going to visit and you're not going to have these views, well, then we're not going to vote for you. It forces a candidate to get down on the ground and have to have moderate views, so you don't get extremists. And essentially, the parties then get to shave off the extremes. And this is both parties. We get more center left, center right candidates, which is really kind of where the country generally sits, going back to what we talked about earlier. So these are a couple of the benefits. It also provides the two-party system. Now, we hear in this country a lot of people saying, two parties. Other countries have 5 parties or 12 parties. If we didn't have the Electoral College, there'd be no primaries. There'd be no general election. Anybody could run. Anybody could run. Right? That's the assumption. Let's get rid of the Electoral College, and then we'll have the most people vote for the candidate. Well, what happens if 20 people run? What if 20 people run in a general election scenario, and then all of a sudden the guy who wins is only winning by 15%? Right? So now, how democratic is that when a candidate that I've never heard of or voted for wins because he found 15% of some group to win by plurality? And so these are a couple of the things that the Electoral College safeguards us from. These are unintended consequences that would completely topsy-turvy our election system. We're too big of a country. We're 300+ million people. And so that's really why it was designed. Of course, the Founding Fathers couldn't project the size or the scope, but it also makes it so that our election system is scalable. So the bigger it gets, the Electoral College can actually scale with the size of the population, which is an important point that actually we don't even mention that in the film, but that's a very important thing. As they added states, the Electoral College was just able to scale because, again, it binds everybody together to vote for one executive, and that executive is supposed to be the executive over the entire country, not over 15% of the population, not over even 51% of the population, but 100% of the population. So that candidate is moderated, that candidate is more flexible, because, again, he's the executive. And this is the point that's kind of important. We mentioned this in the film, is that the presidency is an executive. That's his job. He doesn't make the law. He just executes the law. That's Congress and Senate. And then when you take how Congress and Senate is distributed among the states with senators and Congress, they make the laws. And the president's just supposed to sign it in or veto it out. And so our political climate has made the presidency way more important than its intention was originally designed for, and which makes the Electoral College actually even more important as the presidency has become more politicized.
That's really interesting. And this, this corruption argument that you describe, I think probably the whole country is concerned about corruption in the federal government. I think we can agree. Everyone,
without a doubt.
Everyone.
That's a bipartisan concern.
Yes. So I think that's. I hadn't thought of it this way until we just spoke, but I think that the federal government corruption is probably one of the more compelling cases for the Electoral College, of which there are numerous, and of course in the film, beyond even what you just talked about. You know a lot about this, obviously, but is this, you just kind of been sitting around for years thinking about the Electoral College and its importance? I mean, did someone put you up to this? How did this come about?
Well, it's an interesting topic. It's a great history topic, and again, it's just one of those things where people haven't thought about it, and it comes up every couple of years. And of course, we've been hearing about the idea that we got to get rid of the Electoral College, and so. There's been a movement recently, the National Popular Vote movement, and what they have actually figured out is how to get around the Electoral College, and have made a very successful kind of bid to get rid of it. But people don't know this. They don't know what's happening. And so, it's an interstate compact which allows states to work together. And most interstate compacts are used to, like, say, highways cross over state lines or power lines, or different types of federal sharing, or I'm sorry, state sharing. But they have figured out that if they go to a state, because remember, a state is allowed to assign its electors. They can tell the electors how to vote. And so they said, well, why don't you go to a state government and say, why don't you tell your electors in the state to vote for whoever wins the popular vote? And the state goes, oh, that sounds like a good idea, because we want as many Democratic votes as possible. But what this means is that if a Republican candidate were to win the presidency and get the popular vote, California would go red, even though everyone democratically voted to go blue, because California has joined this interstate compact. And so the interstate compact is probably 80% of the way through finishing, getting enough states to allow this compact to go through. So they need 270 votes worth of states, and then one day you'll wake up and the popular vote will say one thing, but your state will move another direction. And so they could potentially get rid of the Electoral College, or essentially make it inert by 2024. So people don't know this is happening. People are not aware that this is happening. People don't know what the Electoral College or how it works. So we thought it'd be interesting to make a project that addresses what it is, why it's here, and what would happen if it were not here. And so people can be informed that there are people trying to get rid of the Electoral College. And look, people have been trying to get rid of the Electoral College since the Electoral College was written into the Constitution. So it's not new, but this has been the most successful way to get rid of the Electoral College without actually getting rid of the Electoral College.
Right, because just every elector votes the same way in this model.
Absolutely. And hence, it is actually anti-democratic, because the democratic part of the Electoral College is people voting in their state where they choose to live, where they vote for things like taxes, and they vote for things, they vote for all these things. And so they get to vote how their electors go, and everybody respects that. So if the whole state votes blue and it goes red, well, how is that democratic? That's not democratic at all. That's anti-democracy in a lot of ways. And so, it's important for people to be informed. It's very easy to make the argument, shouldn't it be one person, one vote? Isn't the Electoral College leaving people out? Well, when you have an election, there are people who lose elections and they get left out. But the way our system works is they can come back 2 or 4 or 8 years later and they can win. We have elections that are competitive because of systems like this. We have an electoral system that will elect Bill Clinton, then it will elect George Bush, and then it will elect Barack Obama, and then it will elect Donald Trump. That's super diverse. That's a very diverse system. These are 4 very different people that cover very different groups of people that have binded people together. Now, people can debate whether they like these people or not, but again, the system delivers a diversity that's super fascinating and tends to generally satisfy the most people.
What strikes me about this, the new model that you're describing that's being proposed for the Electoral College, or to basically make it inert or not important anymore, not relevant. It speaks to this kind of, I guess, maybe shift towards federalism, or this kind of, sorry, not federalism, but the federal government having more power. Mm-hmm. In fact, federalism, I suppose, is the opposite of that.
The opposite, yeah.
Exactly. So, and that's very interesting, because this is another, I guess, tension that's really highlighted in the film.
Yeah, federalism is another one of those murky terms that people, they kind of know what it is, but they don't know what it is. And we do talk about it because federalism is very important. Federalism is essentially the agreement that, before there was a constitution, all the states were essentially sovereign. And we have to think about it in the context at the beginning of the country. You basically had 13 colonies that were only bound together by the fact that they were at war with England. And by its, and there were a number of other players as well. But the fact of the matter is, like, they were loosely bound together, and they were extremely weak. And they all had their own little governments, and they all had their own little fiefdoms. And what happened is they had to get together, and they had to fight the British, and eventually they were liberated. And then they had to create a system, but they were still sovereigns. They were still essentially, Georgia was its own sovereign place, and North Carolina was its own sovereign place. And so they came up with a way to say, okay, look, you have your sovereign rights, but you'll agree to have a federal government that kind of pulls you all together to become a country. And hence you have the federal government and you have the local government or the state government. And this is federalism. And so how do you make these 13 different groups of people get together and elect a single guy who's the president, right? And so hence that's why the Electoral College works that way, to bind them together. And then of course scale, like we talked about earlier. But again, these states are still sovereigns. So for example, one of the great things about federalism is it allows states to do things ahead of the federal government. It allows a state to be essentially a lab, an experimentation place to do things. So for example, women are allowed to vote in Wyoming way before they're allowed to vote on a federal level, because the state is an independent sovereign and it can do that. It can allow its citizens to do that. Or for example, there is no North or South in the beginning of the country, and one by one states abolish slavery because they are allowed to do that. Well before the federal government actually abolished slavery, and well before certain states' right or federal laws were passed for a number of things. And so, and if you think about it, most of these experiments have to do with rights, right? This is federalism protects the state's ability to protect people's rights or allow them more freedom. So the trajectory of this country from, we had slaves at one point and women weren't allowed to vote and all these other things, the trajectory has been to eliminate those things, and you do it on a local level, and that local level then scales up to the federal level. If you get rid of the Electoral College and you shift all the power to the federal government, then you would have to wait on a group of a body of 535 people to get their act together to pass any of these laws, and it could take years and decades. Whereas a state can do it right away. A state can make that decision. It can be an example, and it can lead the rest of the country, and usually it does. We've had many states, like I said, Wyoming and the northern states for abolishing slavery lead the country into a more freer society, and that's the exciting thing about how federalism works, and it's also how the Electoral College keeps that system intact from the federal government to the local government or state government.
It just strikes me it can also work to the benefit of showing everyone what you might not want to happen.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, well, that's one of the beautiful things. I mean, we have people vote with their feet. I don't like this state, so I'm going to go to another state. I don't want to live in a place where everything's the same. So, you have different industries, you have different laws, you have, some states have no income tax, some states have no sales tax, some states have really strange laws, and some people like that. Some states have different time zones in different parts of the state, or some states follow daylight saving times and others don't. It's up to the state. And that's what's really interesting. It's really interesting when the federal government tries to foist something on a state and a state says no, and they sue them or they push back. And so you have all of these kinds of experiments constantly going on, and we really do get to see what works and what doesn't. And it's fascinating. It's really fascinating. And hey, you can move to another state and try something. I don't like the state, I'm going to leave.
When we first sat down here, you mentioned that this painting here has
prominent
features, so we didn't just put it up for you. Yeah.
Oh, I love this painting. Yes, this painting's in the film quite a few times. It opens and closes the film pretty much.
And so why?
Well, of course, this is the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and again, America's the great experiment. Everything we did is an experiment. We're constantly experimenting. They experimented at this moment. They experimented with the Constitution, which again is largely intact, for multiple centuries now. We are. It's about individualism. It's about innovation, and ultimately it's about liberty as allowing people to be free of tyranny. And so this is the moment where the founding fathers say, we don't want any more tyranny. We're getting rid of tyranny. They sign that declaration. They go to war, and they create the Constitution. And look, is it perfect? It's not perfect by far. But the thing is, it is a system that is designed to always reform and always get better and always, evolve into more enlightenment, I guess you could say, but definitely to more liberty. And if anything is tyrannical, that is the litmus test. Is tyranny is not loved in this country and should be tossed out, and the individual should be protected, and the minority should be protected. We're anti-mob rule, and so the founding fathers they thought through this system. They thought of vertical checks and horizontal checks, whether it be the three branches or federalism or a whole number of things to protect you as an individual. Your voice matters. Even if you're on the losing side, it's still to protect you. And this is a very important moment that kind of sets the stage for what will come. And what has come has been pretty amazing.
So, how did you pick who your experts in the film would be? I thought that was another thing that I thought was really interesting is you have the experts speak directly into the camera, which is not often the case. As a fellow filmmaker, I noticed. But tell me a little bit about how you chose the experts.
Well, the funny thing is that there aren't tons of electoral college people in the world. Again, it's one of those things that people don't. I mean, they'll study American history, they'll study the Revolutionary War, they'll study the Civil War. The electoral college is just one of those things that it's only so many words in the Constitution. It's not a lot. It's not endless pages of paragraphs of things, because again, the Constitution itself is not a huge document. It's very small. It's very kind of compact. And so, many of our experts were actually just experts in the Electoral College or specific parts of, say, federalism. We have people who are specialty, is the Civil War. Just the components to kind of explain. And look, as a filmmaker, I learned tons of things as well, listening to these guys. It was absolutely fascinating. I had a blast sitting down with an Electoral College expert, which is not something you get to do every day, and ask them questions, and they would tell you things, and you sit there and go, wow, I never thought about that. I never thought about how that protects us. And so I wanted to take all that and make sure it was in the movie so that people can really have an understanding that the Electoral College protects your rights, it protects your dominion, it protects you, and to get rid of it would make you subject to potential tyranny. And so that is really kind of the main point of the film.
So you mentioned the system isn't perfect. Mm-hmm. And so what are the problems with the Electoral College system?
Well, of course, the Electoral College system does favor smaller states by small percentages more than larger states. And so that is, why should Wyoming get those 2 senators and California get those 2 senators? That's one of the arguments. Why? Because Wyoming has 500,000 people and California has, 53 million people. So there are some minor inequalities in the system that do favor, because California by itself is larger than the next 40 states, that kind of thing. Missouri has 5 or 6 million people, or these, So the thing is, there is a little bit of extra juice given to smaller states, which give them a slightly larger proportion of the power. But it's also on the Hill as well. And so, again, why should these smaller states, since they have less people, have proportionately the same senatorial power? But again, that's more for the Senate, which is, again, another federal system, part of the federal system. So, ultimately, it still evens out, because in the Electoral College, the way the electors are counted is you get 1 elector per senator, and you get 1 elector per congressman or congressional district. So again, you still have 55, votes with California and only 3 in Wyoming. So ultimately, it actually still balances out that California gets many more votes. But there are some slight extra bonuses that smaller states get to help them have a voice in the Electoral College, which again is protecting those states. It's saying, look, all states are equal when it comes to opinion, but when it comes to other things, states with larger populations have just more votes. So that is one of the criticisms of the Electoral College. And of course, we've addressed that. People have said it's racist because it favored southern states over northern states. But again, when the Constitution was designed, all states except for Massachusetts legalized slavery. There was no North and South. So that argument is moot. And of course, it's the federalist system that allows there to be a North and South. And of course, the southern states get a little bit of a boost because they have slaves, the 3/5 clause. But eventually, thanks to federalism and the Electoral College, the South is also eliminates slavery on a federal level. And so again, there have been moments where there are inequality, but inequality is also part of any system, and we are trying to always make things equal, and we are working towards that. And if ultimately the system rebalances and comes back into line. So yes, there are some inequalities and there are some issues, and there were issues early on, with the vice president, the president, and how you elect them. And of course, we amended that in the Constitution after some very, persnickety elections. But since that, then the system has largely worked. It has largely elected the candidate who's gotten the most votes nationally, except for 5 times out of many presidents. So ultimately, the system does work the way it's intended. And again, if we want to eliminate the system or change the system, it should be done with how it is laid out in the Constitution of a constitutional amendment. So everybody gets to weigh in and everybody gets to deliberate, as opposed to secretly trying to go around and get states to fundamentally change how their electors vote. So, if you want to get rid of the Electoral College, do it the right way. Do it through the amendment, include everyone in the conversation, and deliberate, and then you can get rid of it. But until you do that, it's here to stay, and it's outlined in the film why we should keep it.
Any final thoughts before we finish up?
I think as we go into this election, it's important to really know why things work the way they work. That's why we made the film. So I do encourage people to watch the movie, because we are going to come into a very contentious and potentially constitutionally complicated election in the coming months. And, it's important as you cast your vote to understand why and how it works. And so, again, check out Safeguard, an Electoral College story. And it's on Amazon Prime and iTunes. And we look forward to seeing how it plays out.
Matt Taylor, such a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you for having me.